Okay, everybody. Before we get down to it, I asked ChatGTP to create uh, a short novel. Now, I had to set up certain parameters for, in my mind anyway, for it to follow. So, you know, um, so I went step by step, letting the AI know exactly what I was looking for. Well, I'm going to have, okay, write small novels for me, but before I have to, I want you to set up the parameters of this. Okay, so I let the AI respond. All right, the small novel will have 4 chapters, and each chapter will have 3 pages. Do you understand? And it came back, yes, correct, okay, and asked it. I also wanted to make clear to the AI that when I say play or write chapter 1, page 1, it'll write the first page of that chapter, and then when I say uh, write chapter 1, page 2, it'll continue the story. And each time I asked if it understood, and it came back, you know, in a smart way that yes, okay, this is what we're going to be doing. And so, of course, I gave the premise afterward. Yes, I understand. The story is about a detective from Scotland Yard who's trying to get Jack the Ripper. Okay, so this is where I'm going to take you to. Now, I'm going to be recording. I'm not going to read it to you. It's going to be a UK English default. It's text to speech thing. And it doesn't sound anything like, text to speech on Microsoft. It's something a little bit different, a little bit better. Anyway, this is the entire story, chapter 1, right down to chapter 4 to the end of the small novel. Okay, so let's get to it. I'm going to set up some ambience for you and let the voice read the story to you. Be right back.
Detective Jameson stood at the crime scene, his eyes scanning the dark alleyway for any clues. It was the 5th victim of Jack the Ripper, and the pressure to catch the killer was mounting. Jameson knew that the people of Whitechapel were depending on him and his team to bring the murderer to justice. The body was mutilated beyond recognition, just like the other victims. Jameson could feel his stomach churning at the sight. He had seen a lot in his years at Scotland Yard, but nothing like this. The Ripper was a monster, and Jameson was determined to catch him. As he looked around, Jameson noticed a faint trail of blood leading away from the crime scene. It was barely visible, but Jameson had a hunch. He followed the trail, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a long shot, but he had to try. The trail led Jameson to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Whitechapel. The building was dark and ominous, the perfect hiding spot for someone like the Ripper. Jameson drew his revolver and cautiously approached the entrance. As he stepped inside, Jameson could hear the creaking of floorboards under his feet. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the far end of the warehouse. Jameson cocked his gun and crept forward. The sound led him to a room at the back of the building. The door was closed, but Jameson could hear shuffling coming from the other side. He pressed his ear against the wood and listened. It was definitely someone moving around in there. Jameson took a deep breath and kicked the door open. The room was empty, but Jameson noticed a piece of paper on the floor. He picked it up and read the message scrawled on it. "You'll never catch me, Jameson. I am always one step ahead." Jameson clenched his teeth in frustration. The Ripper was taunting him, playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Jameson knew he had to stay calm and focused if he wanted to catch the killer. He left the warehouse and headed back to Scotland Yard, determined to find any leads he could. As he walked, Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He quickened his pace, his hand resting on his gun. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from an alleyway and blocked Jameson's path. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a top hat pulled low over his face. Jameson raised his gun, ready to defend himself. The man chuckled and raised his hands in surrender. "Easy there, detective," he said. "I'm not your man." Jameson lowered his gun but kept his guard up. "Who are you?" The man tipped his hat. "Call me John. And I might have some information that could be of interest to you." Jameson followed John to a nearby pub, where they sat down at a small table in the corner. John ordered them each a pint of ale and leaned in closer to Jameson. "I've been keeping an eye on things," John said, taking a sip of his drink. "And I think I know who the Ripper is." Jameson raised an eyebrow. "And who might that be?" "His name is Edward Bates," John said. "He's a surgeon by trade, but he's been acting very strange lately. His wife reported him missing a few weeks ago, and I have reason to believe he's the one you're looking for." Jameson sat back in his chair, considering the information. It was a lead, at least. "How do you know all this?" John smiled. "Let's just say I have my ways of finding out things." Jameson nodded. "All right. Thank you for your help, John. I'll look into it." As he left the pub, Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He turned around, but there was no one there. Jameson rubbed his eyes, trying to clear his head. This case was getting to him. He needed to find the Ripper, and soon. The next morning, Jameson went to the address John had given him for Edward Bates. It was a small, run-down house in the heart of Whitechapel. Jameson knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the knob, and to his surprise, the door was unlocked. Jameson drew his gun and cautiously entered the house. The place was a mess, with papers and books scattered everywhere. Jameson made his way to the back of the house, where he found a small laboratory. On one table, there were several surgical tools and a bloody apron. On another table, Jameson found a journal filled with disturbing entries. As he flipped through the pages, Jameson felt his stomach turn. Bates was definitely a sick and twisted man. Suddenly, Jameson heard a noise coming from upstairs. He crept up the stairs, his gun at the ready. At the top of the stairs, Jameson found a closed door. He kicked it open, and there was Bates, sitting in a chair with a bloody knife in his hand. Jameson aimed his gun at Bates. "You're under arrest, Bates." Bates chuckled. "You're too late, Jameson. The fun is already over." Jameson moved closer to Bates, his gun still trained on him. "What are you talking about?" Bates smirked. "I already got away with it. I've been framing other people for my crimes. You'll never be able to prove anything." Jameson knew he had to act fast. He lunged forward and tackled Bates, knocking the knife out of his hand. The two men struggled on the ground, but Jameson was able to overpower Bates and get him in handcuffs. It was finally over. Jameson sat across from Bates in the interrogation room, watching him carefully. Bates sat calmly, his hands cuffed in front of him. "I know it was you, Bates," Jameson said. "You can drop the act." Bates sighed. "Fine. You got me. I am Jack the Ripper." Jameson felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, he had caught the most notorious killer in London's history. "But why did you do it?" Jameson asked. Bates leaned forward, his eyes glinting. It was all about the thrill of the chase, Jameson. The game of cat and mouse. I wanted to see if I could outsmart you and the entire police force of London. Jameson shook his head in disgust. You're sick, Bates. You'll be spending the rest of your life in prison. Bates smirked. At least I'll be remembered as one of the most notorious killers in history. Can you say the same, Jameson? Jameson stood up and walked out of the room, not wanting to give Bates the satisfaction of a response. As he walked down the hallway, Jameson couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. He had finally caught Jack the Ripper. But at what cost? Jameson knew he would never be able to forget the horrors he had seen during the investigation. It was a case that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It had been 3 months since Jameson had caught Edward Bates, and life at Scotland Yard had returned to normal. But Jameson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had a nagging suspicion that there was more to the Jack the Ripper case than he had uncovered. One night, as Jameson was sitting at his desk, he received an anonymous letter. The letter read, "Dear Detective Jameson, I know you think you've solved the Jack the Ripper case, but there's more to it than you realize. Meet me at midnight tonight in Whitechapel. Come alone. Yours truly, a concerned citizen." Jameson didn't know what to make of the letter, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. He left Scotland Yard and headed to Whitechapel, keeping a careful eye out for any suspicious activity. As he approached the meeting spot, Jameson saw a figure waiting for him in the shadows. The figure stepped forward, revealing herself to be a young woman in her early 20s. "What's this all about?" Jameson asked. The woman looked around nervously before speaking. "My sister was a victim of Jack the Ripper. But she wasn't like the others. She was killed in a completely different way. I don't think Bates was responsible for her murder." Jameson was taken aback. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there was more than one killer," the woman said. "And I have evidence to prove it." The woman handed Jameson a small box. "Inside here are letters from my sister's killer. He sent him to me after he killed her. I never went to the police because I was afraid for my life, but I can't keep living with this guilt. Please, detective, you have to help me find him." Jameson opened the box and saw several letters inside, each written in a different handwriting. As he read through them, he realized that the woman was right. The letters were all signed by different names, and the handwriting was inconsistent. "This is damning evidence," Jameson said. "But we need more than just letters to prove that there was more than one killer." The woman nodded. "I know. That's why I've been doing some investigating of my own. I've found a few other victims who were killed in a similar manner to my sister. I think there's a pattern here." Jameson listened intently as the woman explained her findings. As he processed the information, Jameson knew he had to reopen the case. He couldn't let the real killer or killers get away with their crimes. "Thank you for coming forward with this," Jameson said to the woman. "You've given me a lot to think about. I'll do everything in my power to find out who's responsible for your sister's death." The woman nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Jameson headed back to Scotland Yard, his mind racing with possibilities. It was clear that he wasn't done with the Jack the Ripper case just yet. Back at Scotland Yard, Jameson began to sift through the evidence once again, looking for any inconsistencies or overlooked details. He spent long hours poring over the letters from the new suspect, trying to match the handwriting to any other evidence from the original case. As he worked, Jameson couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. He had been so certain that Bates was the culprit, but now he realized how much he had missed. The realization made him even more determined to find the truth, no matter how long it took. Finally, after weeks of careful investigation, Jameson discovered a new lead. He found a witness who had seen a man leaving the scene of one of the murders, a man who matched the description of the suspect in the letters. Jameson tracked down the man, who was now living under a different name, and brought him in for questioning. Under intense scrutiny, the man eventually confessed to being one of the killers. He revealed that there had been a small group of men who had committed the murders, each taking turns and using different methods to throw off suspicion. Jameson felt a sense of relief and satisfaction as he closed the case once and for all. The new suspect was charged and sentenced to life in prison, along with the others involved. Jameson couldn't help but think about the victims and their families, and how they could finally have closure. As he walked out of Scotland Yard, Jameson realized that this case had changed him. He had become more cautious, more diligent, and more aware of the darkness that lurked in the shadows of London. But he also felt a sense of pride in his work, knowing that he had brought justice to those who had been wronged. For Jameson, the Jack the Ripper case would always be a defining moment in his career, a reminder of the power of persistence and determination in the face of evil. Years had passed since the Jack the Ripper case, but for Jameson, the memories still lingered. He had solved many cases since then, but none had ever captivated him in the same way. However, he soon found himself embroiled in a new mystery that would test his skills and challenge everything he thought he knew. It began with a call from an old friend, a retired detective who had been working on a case involving a string of disappearances in the city. The cases were all linked to a single individual, a man known only as the Vanisher. The Vanisher was a ghost, leaving no trace of his victims or any clues to his whereabouts. He seemed to have an uncanny ability to evade the police, slipping through their fingers at every turn. Jameson knew that he had to help. He spent countless hours poring over the case files, looking for any clues that might lead him to the elusive Vanisher. As he dug deeper, he began to realize that this case was even more complex than the Jack the Ripper investigation. The Vanisher seemed to be one step ahead at every turn, always managing to stay one step ahead of the police. But Jameson was determined to catch him, no matter the cost. As he continued to investigate, Jameson began to unravel a web of deceit and corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. The Vanisher was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle, one that threatened to bring down the entire city. Jameson knew that he couldn't do this alone. He reached out to his colleagues at Scotland Yard, asking for their help in taking down the corrupt officials and bringing the Vanisher to justice. The stakes were high, but Jameson was ready for the challenge. He would not rest until the truth was revealed and justice was served. With the help of his colleagues at Scotland Yard, Jameson began to piece together the clues that would eventually lead him to the Vanisher. They followed a trail of evidence that took them from the streets of London to the highest levels of government. Along the way, Jameson encountered numerous obstacles and faced many dangers. He was threatened, attacked, and nearly killed, but he refused to give up. As the investigation progressed, Jameson began to uncover a sinister plot that went far beyond the Vanisher's crimes. It involved powerful people in positions of authority who had been using their influence to cover up their own misdeeds. Despite the danger, Jameson continued to pursue the truth. He was driven by a sense of justice that would not allow him to rest until the perpetrators were brought to justice. Finally, after months of tireless work, Jameson and his team were able to gather enough evidence to bring the corrupt officials to justice. The Vanisher was apprehended, and the people of London were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Jameson received numerous commendations for his work on the case, but for him, the greatest reward was the knowledge that justice had been served. As he looked back on his career, Jameson realized that it was cases like these that had defined him as a detective. He had been tested in ways he never thought possible, but in the end, he had emerged victorious. Now, as he walked away from the scene of the Vanisher's arrest, Jameson knew that he had truly made a difference. He had helped to make the world a safer place, and he had done it all in the name of justice. As Jameson walked away from the courthouse after the final verdict was delivered, he felt a sense of closure. The case of the Vanisher had been his most challenging yet, and it had taken a toll on him physically and emotionally. But now, he could finally put it behind him and move on. He walked through the busy streets of London, taking in the sights and sounds of the city he had sworn to protect. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The nightmares that had plagued him for months seemed to fade away, and he knew that he could finally sleep soundly at night. As he reached his home, Jameson felt a sense of gratitude for all the people who had helped him along the way. His colleagues at Scotland Yard, the witnesses who had come forward with information, and even the people of London who had kept their eyes open for any suspicious activity, all of them had played a part in bringing the Vanisher to justice. As Jameson settled into his armchair with a cup of tea, he allowed himself to reflect on his career. It had been a long and difficult journey, but he knew that he had made a difference. He had protected the people of London, and he had upheld the law to the best of his ability. And as he closed his eyes, Jameson knew that he had truly found his calling. He was a detective, through and through, and he would continue to fight for justice as long as he was able.
Well, there you have it. That's a short story or short novel, however, which way you want to look at it, that ChatGPT made. And all rights belong to OpenAI. Um, so there you have it. That's pretty cool, actually. It's I've been messing around with Chat GPT for a bit now, and it's turned out that it's quite interesting and kind of addictive. All right, take care, everybody, and have a good one.